What if the people you thought you knew best were not who they seemed? What if beneath every smile, every gesture, every carefully chosen word, there lurked an entirely different self, hidden even from the person themselves? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, believed that this was not only true, but inevitable. He devoted over 5 decades of his life to mapping the human psyche, and what he uncovered is as unsettling as it is transformative. Jung discovered that we all wear masks, personas crafted to present ourselves in the way we want others to see us. But behind these masks lies what he called the shadow, the collection of repressed qualities, desires, and truths we refuse to acknowledge. Jung argued that we rarely see another person's true self in daily life, because most of the time, we remain in control, maintaining our chosen mask with remarkable skill. But he also discovered something extraordinary. There are specific psychological triggers that can rip away this mask in an instant, exposing what truly lies beneath. Even more astonishing, he found that you can reveal these hidden depths with just 2 carefully chosen questions. When asked in the right way, they bypass the polished surface and tap into unconscious forces that shape every thought, every reaction, every decision. Why does this matter? Because until we bring the unconscious into awareness, Jung said, it rules our lives in ways we cannot recognize. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, he warned. If you've ever wondered why people repeat the same mistakes, why they sabotage themselves, or why relationships break down in familiar patterns, Jung would tell you it is because unexamined shadow material is pulling the strings. And so he devoted his life to understanding not only how to uncover it in others, but most importantly, how to confront it in ourselves. To understand why his 2 questions work, we first need to grasp how Jung viewed the psyche. On the surface sits the persona, the mask of social roles and acceptable traits we show to the world. Beneath it is the ego, our conscious sense of identity. Below that lies the personal unconscious, a storehouse of repressed experiences, forgotten memories, and denied emotions. Interwoven with this is the shadow, the rejected parts of ourselves that we refuse to own, whether negative or positive. And beneath all these layers lies the collective unconscious, a deep reservoir of universal human patterns and archetypes. For Jung, the shadow was central. It was not simply a place where we stored bad qualities like anger, jealousy, or selfishness. It also contained our rejected strengths, our joy, our ambition, our creativity traits we buried because they were not welcomed by family or society. The shadow was everything we denied in order to preserve the image we wished to present. But Jung found that this repression came at a cost. What we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves does not disappear. Instead, it bursts out in disguised ways, often projected onto others. And here is where Jung's first great discovery comes into play. He realized that when we criticize others, when we declare that we cannot stand certain kinds of people, we are often revealing our own disowned traits. He called this projection. In his view, the things that irritate us most in others are rarely random. They are mirrors reflecting qualities that exist in us, qualities we would rather not admit. This realization forms the foundation of his first revealing question: what kind of person can you absolutely not stand? At first glance, it seems like a simple question. We might casually answer that we dislike liars, or selfish people, or those who play the victim. But Jung insisted that the answer reveals far more about us than about others. The dishonest person who rages against liars may be struggling with their own tendency to twist the truth, whether to others or to themselves. The one who hates selfishness may secretly be repressing their own needs so forcefully that they cannot tolerate seeing them expressed in others. The person who despises weakness may be running from their own vulnerability, constructing an identity of toughness to keep fear at bay. What makes this question so powerful is not simply the content of the answer, but the intensity with which it is given. Jung observed that the more heated someone becomes when describing the traits they cannot stand, the more likely those very traits live in their own shadow. In this way, irritation becomes a map pointing directly to the places where we have buried parts of ourselves. And the shadow, Jung insisted, is not our enemy but our greatest teacher. By tracing what triggers us, we can uncover the rejected pieces of our humanity that long to be acknowledged. Yet, as revealing as the first question is, Jung's second question penetrates even deeper. He asked people to recall a time when they were absolutely certain they were right, only to discover later that they were wrong. To Jung, the way a person answered this was far more revealing than the story itself. That is because being wrong threatens what he called the ego ideal, our image of ourselves as competent, intelligent, and reliable. When that image is shaken, the mask falls and the true self emerges. Some people respond with denial, refusing to admit they were ever wrong. Others rationalize, inventing explanations to justify their mistake. Still others project blame onto others or trivialize the situation to protect their pride. But Jung noticed that a rare few respond differently. They pause, reflect, and accept their mistake without collapsing in shame or mounting a defense. These individuals, he believed, had reached a state of psychological maturity he called integration, the ability to hold together both strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures, without shattering their sense of self. These two questions, Jung argued, reveal more about a person's true nature than years of observation. They cut through layers of persona and ego, exposing the raw, unfiltered truth of who someone is. And yet, their power does not lie only in what they reveal about others. They also turn the mirror back on us, for when we ask them, we cannot help but consider our own answers. Who do we despise, and what does that say about us? How do we react when proven wrong, and what does that reveal about our ego? The challenge, Jung believed, was not merely to see others more clearly, but to use these insights to know ourselves. For every irritation we feel, every defensiveness we exhibit, points to something within us that remains unexamined. And only when we make the unconscious conscious, only when we confront the shadow and accept our fallibility, can we step onto the path of true psychological growth. Jung's insights take us deeper once we begin to look not only at the questions, but at the patterns that emerge in the way people answer them. Over the years, he noticed that individuals tended to fall into distinct categories. Each category revealed something profound about their relationship with the shadow and the ego, and each carried its own consequences for how they moved through the world. The first category Jung observed was what he called the inflated ego type. These individuals projected all negative traits outward and refused to acknowledge any fault of their own. If asked what kind of person they could not stand, they might describe a long list of qualities with unshakable certainty, never considering that they themselves might embody the very traits they condemned. If asked to recall a time they were wrong, they would struggle to find an example, or else insist that external circumstances had been to blame. To Jung, this level of denial was dangerous. He believed that people in this state had become so rigidly attached to their ego ideal that they could no longer bear the discomfort of imperfection. Their self-image was brittle, and their denial of shadow material often preceded personal crises, breakdowns, or destructive patterns. The second category was the self-deprecating type. These individuals swung in the opposite direction. When asked about people they could not stand, they often described traits that they themselves admitted to possessing. When asked about being wrong, they could rattle off examples with an air of exaggerated humility. On the surface, this appeared honest, even admirable. But Jung observed that this too could function as a defense mechanism. By confessing quickly and abundantly, they avoided the deeper work of truly grappling with their shadow. Their admissions became a performance of modesty, allowing them to remain safe from authentic confrontation with themselves. And then there was the rarest category, the integrated type. These individuals could acknowledge projections without collapsing into shame, and they could admit mistakes without defensiveness or rationalization. Jung believed they had reached a state of psychological integration, where the shadow was not denied but embraced as part of the whole. To them, imperfection was not a threat but a teacher. Their sense of self was not dependent on being flawless, but on being real. This, Jung argued, was the hallmark of mental health, the capacity to accept both the light and the dark within without needing to disown either. What makes these patterns so important is their consistency. Jung discovered that once you identify someone's pattern, you can predict their behavior with striking accuracy. Because though people may appear inconsistent on the surface, their unconscious strategies remain stable. The inflated ego will defend their image of perfection in every arena at work, in relationships, in moments of conflict. The self-deprecating type will seek safety through exaggerated modesty in many different contexts. And the integrated type will show resilience and honesty across situations, even when it costs them comfort or status. But Jung also offered warnings. He identified specific red flags that signal psychological imbalance when people answer these two questions. The first warning sign was when someone projected all negative traits onto a single group. Healthy individuals, he found, could recognize that flaws exist across humanity. But when projection becomes narrowed onto one category, whether a political party, a gender, a race, or a profession, it signaled a dangerous split in the psyche, a refusal to see complexity. The second warning sign was the insistence that one had never been wrong about anything important. Jung called this psychological inflation a detachment from reality so profound that it often collapsed under pressure. Such denial created lives built on fragile illusions, and when those illusions shattered, the resulting crises were often devastating. A third warning sign was the sudden shift in energy when someone described what they hated. Jung noticed that when people's tone or body language changed dramatically, it meant the question had struck a nerve, unearthing a powerful shadow complex. The more dramatic the reaction, the more repressed material was being touched. The fourth warning sign was immediate deflection, when someone refused to engage with the questions at all, turning them aggressively back onto the asker. Jung believed they were avoiding the most significant shadow material of all. In these moments, he said, what remains hidden is often precisely what most needs to be faced. Yet, Jung's genius was not only in diagnosis. He understood the transformative power of self-reflection. He believed that these two questions were not simply tools for exposing others, but invitations to growth. For when you ask them to someone else, you inevitably ask them of yourself. Who do you despise, and why? How do you react to being wrong? These answers can sting, but Jung insisted that the sting was where healing began. He often reminded his students that the shadow is not just the repository of what is ugly or shameful. It also contains buried vitality, creativity, and joy. Many people reject qualities not because they are bad, but because they felt unsafe or unacceptable in their original environment. A child told not to be too loud may bury their natural exuberance. One told not to show vulnerability may learn to hide tenderness. Later in life, these suppressed qualities re-emerge as irritation when seen in others. By noticing what triggers us, Jung argued, we gain a map back to our own lost parts. And the second question offers something just as powerful. Our relationship to fallibility, how we handle being wrong, reveals the degree of flexibility in our ego. A rigid ego cannot survive the blow of error without collapsing or fighting back, but a flexible ego can endure the discomfort, reflect, and adapt. This, Jung believed, is what allows true growth. He called it holding the tension of the opposites, remaining with the discomfort of being both right and wrong, strong and weak, flawed and worthy, until a new level of wholeness emerges. These insights do not merely improve our understanding of others, they transform our understanding of ourselves. They remind us that every irritation is a mirror, every mistake an opportunity, They call us to abandon illusions of perfection and instead embrace the fullness of our humanity. And in doing so, they offer not only psychological clarity, but the possibility of authentic transformation. When you begin to reflect on these questions within yourself, you start to notice the subtle ways in which projection shapes daily life. The colleague who irritates you with their arrogance might be holding up a mirror to your own buried pride. The family member whose constant complaining drives you to frustration might reveal your own suppressed resentment. The stranger whose carefree joy feels excessive to you may simply be showing you the happiness you never gave yourself permission to express. Jung believed that our strongest emotional reactions are never random. They are signals, flashing lights pointing us toward the unacknowledged corners of our psyche. To recognize this is not to wallow in guilt or shame, but to accept the complexity of being human. Jung insisted that wholeness does not come from pretending to be entirely good, or entirely rational, or entirely in control. It comes from integrating the full spectrum of qualities within us, the noble and the petty, the strong and the fragile, the kind and the cruel. The shadow, he said, is not simply a collection of flaws, but the key to authenticity. By owning what we deny, we free ourselves from the exhausting work of maintaining a false image. The second question brings us even closer to the heart of growth. Recall a moment when you were certain you were right, only to discover that you were wrong. Perhaps it was an argument with a loved one, where you later realized they had been telling the truth all along. Perhaps it was a decision at work that backfired, exposing blind spots you had overlooked. Perhaps it was a belief you clung to for years, until new evidence shattered it. How did you react in that moment? Did you retreat into silence, refusing to acknowledge the mistake? Did you lash out defensively, shifting the blame onto someone else? Did you make excuses to soften the blow to your pride? Or did you pause, breathe, and allow yourself to admit what had happened? Jung observed that this reaction reveals the true strength of character. To admit being wrong requires humility, and humility is not weakness, but courage. It is the courage to face reality without hiding behind illusions. It is the willingness to value truth over image, learning over pride. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming your authentic self. And central to individuation is the ability to confront not only the shadow, but also the limits of our certainty. This is why Jung placed such importance on holding the tension of opposites. When we are wrong, our ego pushes us toward extremes. We either deny the mistake to preserve our self-image, or we collapse into shame, seeing ourselves as worthless. But the deeper path, Jung believed, was to hold both truths at once. Yes, we were wrong. And yes, we are still worthy. Yes, we carry flaws. And yes, we also carry potential. In that tension lies the possibility of growth, the ability to move beyond rigid patterns into a fuller experience of self. As unsettling as these realizations may be, they also offer liberation. For when we see others harshly, we begin to soften our judgments, recognizing that their flaws are not alien, but human. When we see ourselves harshly, we begin to soften too, realizing that mistakes are not fatal but instructive. Jung believed that compassion flows naturally once we understand projection. If I can deceive myself, of course others can. If I can deny my vulnerability, of course others do. If I can lash out defensively, of course others will. To know our own shadow is to stop expecting perfection in others and to start seeing their struggles as reflections of our own. This perspective transforms relationships. Conflicts with partners, once dominated by blame, become opportunities for mutual recognition. Tensions with colleagues, once fueled by irritation, become invitations to examine hidden dynamics. Even strangers, whose behavior once seemed incomprehensible, are understood as acting out the same universal patterns that run through us all. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. and he meant it literally. Every irritation is a lesson, every projection a mirror, every mistake a chance to integrate what was once divided. But Jung also issued a warning. Knowledge of the psyche can be misused. To learn how to read others is a powerful skill, and with power comes temptation. Jung observed that some people use psychological insights as weapons, manipulating others by exploiting their shadow material. But he cautioned that such manipulation always produces what he called psychological poison. It damages not only the one who is manipulated, but also the one who manipulates, for it strengthens the very defenses that prevent true self-knowledge. The purpose of seeing others clearly, Jung insisted, was not to control them, but to connect with them more authentically. The deeper risk, he said, is that we use our insights about others as a way to avoid looking at ourselves. It is far easier to dissect the flaws of those around us than to confront the uncomfortable truths within. Many who pride themselves on their psychological sharpness become, in Jung's words, voyeurs of the psyche, endlessly analyzing others while remaining blind to their own projections. This, he believed, was the greatest danger of psychological knowledge, that it becomes yet another mask, another way to avoid the work of individuation. That is why Jung always turned the questions back on the self. Before you ask another person what kind of individual they cannot stand, ask yourself. Before you ask someone to describe a time they were wrong, recall your own and listen closely to the answers. For in those answers lie the keys to your own shadow, your own defenses, your own path to integration. To walk Jung's path is to accept that the most frightening journey is not outward but inward. The shadow is not some exotic theory. It lives in our everyday reactions, in the sigh we give when someone annoys us, in the pride we defend when proven wrong, in the secrets we keep even from ourselves. It is easy to imagine that transformation lies in changing others, in deciphering their motives, and predicting their behavior. But Jung insisted that the real work begins when we turn the gaze upon our own hearts. He saw this clearly in his patients. Those who spent their energy cataloging the faults of others rarely found relief, no matter how accurate their observations. Their lives remained riddled with conflicts, because they could not recognize that the enemies they condemned outside were also alive within. Those who began to acknowledge their own shadows, however, found something remarkable. Their irritations softened, their relationships deepened, their sense of inner conflict loosened, as though a great weight had been lifted. To Jung, this was the evidence that integration had begun. He often spoke of life as a series of mirrors. Every person we meet reflects something back to us, whether we like it or not. The colleague whose arrogance stings may reflect the pride we repress. The friend whose endless optimism irritates us may reveal the joy we have buried. The enemy whose cruelty terrifies us may confront us with our own capacity for harm. These mirrors are not comfortable, but they are necessary. Without them, we would remain blind to vast regions of ourselves. With them, we are invited to wholeness. The same applies to fallibility. To see ourselves being wrong is to see how fragile our ego can be. We want so desperately to be right that we twist reality to protect the illusion. We justify, we deny, we shift blame, we trivialize. But in doing so, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to grow. Jung knew that error is not failure, but revelation. It reveals the hidden mechanisms by which the ego protects itself. It reveals the stories we tell to avoid discomfort. It reveals the cost of clinging to certainty in a world that is never certain. To embrace being wrong is to step into humility, and humility is the soil where wisdom grows. Once we begin to recognize these patterns, we see them everywhere. In relationships, we notice how lovers project their insecurities onto each other, blaming the other for qualities they cannot face in themselves. In families, we see how generations pass down unresolved shadows, each child carrying the repressed fears of the parents. In workplaces, we see conflicts flare not from facts, but from fragile egos struggling to defend their identities. Even in politics and culture, we see how entire groups project their shadows onto others, creating divisions that mirror their own denied traits. Jung understood that these dynamics scale from the personal to the collective, shaping not only individual lives but the course of societies. And yet, he never saw this as a reason for despair. Quite the opposite. For Jung believed that the act of honest reflection, even in small doses, carried transformative power. When we pause to ask ourselves why someone irritates us so deeply, we reclaim a piece of our shadow. When we admit a mistake without defensiveness, we strengthen our capacity for integration. When we hold both our flaws and our strengths in the same frame, we become more whole. And when we do this, our relationships change. They become less about control and defense, more about authenticity and connection. This is why Jung emphasized that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. To become whole is not to become perfect. It is to accept the contradictions that make us human. It is to embrace the shadow alongside the light, the mistakes alongside the triumphs, the fragility alongside the strength. It is to live not behind a mask, but in the open, with all the risks and rewards that honesty brings. But Jung's warning still echoes: do not use this knowledge as a weapon. To see another's shadow is a sacred responsibility. It can be used to manipulate, to exploit their blind spots, to bend them to our will. But Jung called this a psychological poison, one that corrupts both parties. The true task is to use this knowledge to understand, to empathize, to connect. For in recognizing the shadow of another, we are also recognizing our own. To treat their vulnerability with respect is to honor our shared humanity. And so the questions return. Who do you despise, and how do you react when you are wrong? They are deceptively simple, yet inexhaustible. Every time you answer them, new layers of the shadow are revealed. Every time you reflect on them, you reclaim another fragment of yourself. Every time you confront them honestly, you move closer to the wholeness Jung called individuation. The journey is not easy. It requires courage to face what we have buried. It requires humility to admit when we are wrong. It requires compassion to extend understanding to others instead of judgment. But Jung believed that this was the most important work a human being could do. For until we know ourselves fully, we cannot truly know others. Until we embrace our own shadows, we cannot truly love. Until we accept our own fallibility, we cannot truly grow. Jung's insights lead us to a profound truth. Every human being carries within them the full spectrum of possibility. The capacity for kindness and cruelty, wisdom and foolishness, courage and fear, generosity and selfishness, they all coexist within us. What separates one person from another is not the presence of these qualities, but whether they are acknowledged or denied. The shadow is nothing more than the collection of traits we refuse to own, and the act of projection is simply our psyche's way of placing them onto others so that we do not have to face them. This is why Jung's first question, what kind of person can you not stand, is so powerful. It reveals not only what we reject in others, but what we have disowned in ourselves. It is a mirror, sometimes merciless, but always instructive. And this is why his second question, when were you absolutely certain you were right? Only to find you were wrong cuts even deeper. It forces us to confront how we handle imperfection, how fragile or resilient our ego truly is. Together, these two questions map the terrain of our unconscious, exposing both the shadows we project and the defenses we construct. But Jung did not stop with individuals. He saw these patterns operating at every level of human life. In relationships, partners often battle not each other, but the projections of their own shadows. A wife accuses her husband of being controlling, blind to her own attempts at subtle manipulation. A husband